Dr. Elijah Carter thought he understood church potlucks. After all, he had attended them for years. He knew there would be food. He knew there would be fellowship. And he knew there would be enough leftovers to feed half the county. What he did not know was what would happen when a genie decided to bring dessert. This is the Professor and Jennie Chronicles, Episode 9, The Big Potluck. The Friday before the church potluck, Dr. Carter sat in his office at Dancy University, grading papers. Stacks of books covered his desk. Sunlight streamed through the office window, and beside her emerald bottle sat Jennie. She was reading a church bulletin she had borrowed from Bible study. Suddenly she looked up. Professor Carter? What is a potluck? The professor smiled. He should have known that question was coming. Our church is having one tomorrow. I know. Jennie pointed at the bulletin. It says everyone should bring food. That's right. Jennie blinked. Everyone. Most everyone. Why? Professor Carter leaned back in his chair. Because people enjoy sharing. Jennie frowned. Sharing food. Yes. With other people? Yes. On purpose. Professor Carter laughed. Yes, Jennie. On purpose. Jennie shook her head. That seems very inefficient. The professor laughed even harder. Jennie continued. If there are 70 people. Okay. Why don't they simply prepare food for 70 people? Because that's not the point. Then what is the point? Professor Carter smiled. Fellowship. Jennie frowned. Church people use that word constantly. Fellowship. Fellowship hall. Fellowship dinner. Fellowship breakfast. Fellowship committee. She still wasn't completely sure what it meant. The next afternoon they arrived at church. Cars filled the parking lot. People carried casserole dishes through the doors. Others carried desserts. Children ran across the sidewalk. Church members greeted one another with smiles and hugs. Jennie followed Professor Carter into the fellowship hall. Then she stopped walking. Completely. The room was covered in food. Long tables stretched from one end of the hall to the other. Fried chicken, ham, roast beef, greens, macaroni and cheese, potato salad, cornbread, pies, cookies, cakes, banana pudding, and dozens of dishes Jennie couldn't even identify. She slowly turned toward Professor Carter. Professor. Yes, there are 70 people here. Probably. Jennie pointed toward the tables. There is enough food for 700. Professor Carter laughed. Jennie wasn't joking. She started counting dishes, then counted again, then counted a third time. A church member walked past carrying another casserole. Jennie's eyes widened. They're still bringing food. Yes. Why? Because that's what happens at church potlucks. Jennie stared at the growing mountain of food. Church people are terrible at math. Then Jennie smiled. I brought something. Professor Carter looked interested. You did. Jennie proudly lifted a covered cake carrier. Inside was a beautiful angel food cake. Perfectly golden. Perfectly round. Covered with strawberries. The professor stared. The cake looked almost too perfect. That made him nervous. Very nervous. Jennie. Yes. Did you make this? Of course. Professor Carter narrowed his eyes. Did you use magic? Jennie immediately looked away. Then at the ceiling. Then at the floor. Then back at him. Maybe a little. Professor Carter closed his eyes. Oh no. Jennie frowned. What? Whenever you say a little, it never means a little. It was one spell. The professor looked horrified. One spell. A very small spell. What exactly did you do? Jennie smiled. I made it lighter. Professor Carter froze. Lighter? Angel food cake is supposed to be light and fluffy. Professor Carter slowly turned toward the cake. Then back toward Jennie. Then back toward the cake. The cake slowly rose half an inch above the table. Professor Carter pointed. There. Jennie gasped. The cake immediately dropped back down. Nobody else seemed to notice. Professor Carter looked toward heaven. Lord, please help me. Jennie smiled weakly. In my defense, you have a defense. I didn't think it would keep getting lighter. The professor sighed. This is going to be a very long afternoon. Unfortunately, the afternoon was just getting started. Within minutes, Jennie found herself surrounded. 3 church mothers had appeared. Nobody saw them approach. They simply materialized. like highly organized angels. One looked at Jennie. Baby, you're too skinny. Jennie blinked. Another handed her a plate. A third immediately began adding food. Macaroni, greens, cornbread, chicken, potato salad, more chicken, then another piece of cornbread. Jennie looked horrified. Oh, that's enough. The church mother added more. Really, that's enough. Another spoonful landed on the plate. Jennie looked desperately toward Professor Carter. Professor Carter immediately became fascinated with the bulletin board across the room. Jennie stared. He wasn't helping. One church mother smiled. You need to eat. Another nodded. A growing girl needs food. Jennie whispered. I'm over 1,000 years old. Nobody heard her. 5 minutes later, she was carrying enough food for 4 people. And somewhere behind her, the angel food cake had started floating again. Jennie spent the next several minutes trying to survive. Not the floating cake. The church mothers. Everywhere she turned, someone offered her food. Try the sweet potatoes. You haven't tasted the dressing. Take some pie. Baby, you need another roll. Jennie had never worked so hard in her life. She finally escaped to a corner table and sat beside Professor Carter. Her plate looked like a small mountain. The professor smiled. You survived. Barely. They seem to like you. Jennie stared at her overloaded plate. I think they're trying to feed me until next year. Professor Carter laughed. They do that to everyone. Then the professor's smile vanished. His eyes moved past Jennie, toward the dessert table. Jennie slowly turned. The angel food cake was floating again. Not much. Only a few inches. But it was definitely floating. Jennie quietly pointed one finger. The cake slowly drifted downward. Professor Carter relaxed. For approximately 3 seconds. Then the cake started rising again. The afternoon continued. Church members filled the fellowship hall with conversation. Children laughed. Friends greeted one another. People moved from table to table. And for the first time, Jennie began paying attention. Not to the food. To the people. At one table, a family was asking prayer for a sick relative. At another table, a young couple introduced their new baby. Near the wall, 2 older men were sharing stories from years ago. Everywhere she looked, people were encouraging one another, listening, laughing, praying, helping. The food seemed almost secondary. Jennie looked toward Professor Carter. I think I'm beginning to understand. Understand what? Fellowship. The professor smiled. What do you think it means? Jennie glanced around the room. I thought everyone came for the food. Professor Carter nodded. A lot of people think that. But they came for each other. The professor smiled. Now you're getting it. A few moments later, the floating cake tried to escape again. Jennie spotted it drifting toward the punch bowl. She quietly waved her hand beneath the table. The cake changed direction. Professor Carter nearly choked on his tea. Jennie smiled innocently. The professor shook his head. One of these days you're going to give me gray hair. Jennie pointed toward his temples. You already have some. The professor stared at her. Jennie grinned. Just a little. As the afternoon continued, Jennie noticed someone sitting alone. An elderly widow had arrived late. Most of the food had already been picked over. The woman smiled politely as people greeted her. But her table remained empty. Jennie watched. Nobody was ignoring her. Everyone was simply busy. The widow looked toward the serving tables, then back toward her empty plate. Jennie's heart softened. For a moment, she forgot all about the floating cake. She stood, picked up a plate, and walked toward the food tables. Professor Carter watched curiously. Jennie carefully selected food. Chicken, greens, macaroni, cornbread, a slice of pie. Then she carried the plate across the room. The elderly woman looked surprised. Oh my, Jennie smiled. I thought you might be hungry. The woman smiled warmly. Thank you, sweetheart. Jennie sat beside her. For the next several minutes, she listened. The widow told stories about church dinners from years ago. Stories about her husband. Stories about raising children. Stories about church members who had gone home to be with the Lord. Jennie listened carefully. For the first time all day, she completely forgot about the cake. That turned out to be a mistake. A very big mistake. Across the room, the angel food cake was rising. Slowly, steadily, higher. and higher, and higher. Nobody noticed. At first, the cake floated above the dessert table, then above the heads of nearby church members, then halfway across the fellowship hall. Still nobody noticed. Everyone was busy talking, laughing, sharing stories. Then a little boy looked up. His eyes widened. He pointed toward the ceiling. Mama. Nobody heard him. The boy pointed harder. Mama. His mother looked up, then froze. The floating cake drifted gracefully through the air. The woman blinked. Twice. I'm sorry. What? Is that cake flying? The room became quiet. One by one people looked upward. Conversation stopped. Fork stopped. Laughter stopped. Soon the entire fellowship hall was staring at the ceiling. The angel food cake floated peacefully overhead, like it belonged there. Professor Carter slowly lowered his head into his hands. Oh no. Jennie looked up, then gasped. Oh no. The entire room watched. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the church mothers were speechless. For several seconds, complete silence filled the fellowship hall. Then the little boy smiled, pointed at the floating dessert, and proudly announced, Look, it's an angel food cake. The room exploded with laughter. People laughed so hard they had to sit down. Even the church mothers laughed. The widow laughed. The little boy laughed. Professor Carter laughed. Eventually, even Jennie laughed. The floating cake slowly drifted back toward the dessert table. Nobody cared anymore. The mystery had become the funniest moment of the day. Later that evening, the fellowship hall began to empty. People carried leftovers home. Tables were cleaned. Chairs were folded. And church members said their goodbyes. Jennie stood quietly beside Professor Carter. What are you thinking about? Jennie smiled. I was wrong. About what? The food. Professor Carter nodded. The food wasn't the important part. No. What was? Jennie looked around the room one last time. The people. The professor smiled. Exactly. That night, back in the office at Dancy University, Jennie sat beside her emerald bottle. The angel food cake rested safely on the desk nearby. Professor Carter glanced suspiciously at it. So, Jennie smiled. So, what did you learn today? Jennie thought for a moment, then smiled. I learned church people bring far. Too much food. The professor laughed. That's true. I learned church mothers are impossible to escape. Also true. And I learned fellowship isn't really about eating. Professor Carter nodded. What is it about? Jennie smiled warmly. It's about sharing what God has given you. The professor smiled. That's exactly right. Jennie looked at the cake, then at the professor, then back at the cake. For a moment everything was quiet. Then the cake floated 2 inches into the air. Professor Carter sighed. Jennie sighed. Both stared at the cake. Then both burst out laughing. And Jennie learned that day that some people share food. Some share encouragement. Some share kindness. Some share friendship. And sometimes a genie shares dessert. As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. 1 Peter, chapter 4, verse 10.